Hey everyone, welcome back to the Thing About Wildlife in a Nutshell, where you will hear a bite sized story from our guest wildlifers' time in their field. Our lives among nature tend to be a string of funny, intimidating, or simply absurd anecdotes, and I'm going to be bringing these to you through some wonderfully diverse and fascinating voices. Now, I have to admit, this week's episode may be a tad more than just a nutshell. And that's because I ended up delving fairly deeply into a conversation about snakes in Indian cities with today's guests. How we perceive them, the species we're likely to encounter, the ethics of handling them, and much, much more. This is also our 20th episode, which is so exciting to me. It's humbling to see how far we've come since we launched last year, and I just wanted to take a moment to thank you, the listener, for keeping us encouraged, for tuning in week after week. In today's episode, I spoke to Chayant Gonsalves, naturalist, birder, artist, and all round snake enthusiast. After completing his training in wildlife biology and conservation from the National Center for Biological Sciences in Bangalore, he's found himself going back to his roots and innate love for urban biodiversity, which he continues to engage with through snake rescues, filmmaking, photography, nature trails, and art. Chayant and I were batchmates during our masters, which is where I first discovered how multi talented he is. It was wonderful to catch up with him and hear about his reptilian tales, and I hope you enjoy our conversation too. On to today's episode, the thing about urban snakes. Hey Chayant, thanks so much for joining me today. I'm really excited to be talking to you on the podcast officially and on record as opposed to how we usually have our conversations.
Yeah, hi Ashika. It's so good to be here. I'm thrilled to be on the Thing About Wildlife podcast, and this is actually strange for me because I'm not used to either being broadcasted or, in fact, talking to you on a video call. We usually have in-person conversations, so this is a new on many fronts, I think.
That's true. Yeah, I think now that I think about it, we've almost never caught up on a video call, and usually long time passes between us meeting. And but it's good to have this opportunity anyway and talk about some things that usually come up casually in conversation, but which I think are really important. And it's good to have this chance now to ask you to delve into it a little more, and hopefully I'll know a lot more about you by the end of this as well. So yeah, really,
Yeah,
really glad
I'm
to have you
super excited to be here.
here. One of the main reasons I wanted to talk to you today is that you do many different things which are very interesting, and
Hmm.
one aspect of it which I wanted to focus on today was your work with snakes. And since you were really young, you went to a beautiful school called Center for Learning, which you can also tell us a little more about maybe. And I know you've had some very interesting experiences and formative experiences as you were growing, which were related to nature and wildlife. And it's led you to work with these animals very closely, even now, despite the fact that you spend most of your time within the bounds of a city. And yet you seem to be constantly surrounded by wildlife, literally every single day. So how did this come to be? Talk me through some of your early experiences and how you came to work with these kinds of animals.
I've definitely been really lucky in my journey. I think the first time I would have seen a snake is actually really similar to what most people would have been like a snake in real life, which was at a zoo with my family. And I'm sure I think that was in the Bannerghatta Zoo in Bangalore. And I remember in the first few years, every time I would see one, even at the zoo, I remember being quite afraid. And I think that's a feeling that most people relate with, and it stays with a lot of people. And like you mentioned, the school that I went to was in, it so happened that the campus was in a place which, we were surrounded by agricultural fields, and there was some scrub forest, and there were a lot of snakes in general around. For many years, like I said, they were a source of fear. And they were also very, very strange and mysterious, because snakes are unlike any other kind of animal, in my opinion. They're both fascinating to watch in the things that they do, the way they move, the strange form that they have. But they're also extremely, they trigger, I think, something very primal in most of us, which is, that feeling of the hairs raising at the back of your neck. And I think it was only by seeing people, destigmatize them. We always had, I think, some faculty or student who was interested in snakes and was good with working with them. And so every time they would, I remember when I was about 6 years old, I was terrified because there was a tiny worm snake in our classroom. And it was the most sobering experience to just watch a senior come very undramatically put down his handkerchief on the ground next to it, wait for the snake to slither onto it, and without touching it even once, lift the handkerchief and leave it into the garden next door. So I think repeated experiences like that, where it kept being hammered home that there was very little to fear, and that these are animals just like insects and squirrels and birds, which we're so used to seeing everywhere. That kind of helped, it helped me start to see them in a slightly different light. Today it seems that, yeah, I do work a lot more with snakes than I have before, and it's very, very much limited just to the neighborhood that I live in. And it's very goal specific. It's if a snake comes into someone's house, or if it looks like it's going to be killed by either by someone or by a vehicle, or maybe a cat, then we go. There are a few of us who will go and remove it from that immediate situation. And this is something which, you know wherever you are in India, there are many, many people in every single state who do this on an everyday basis, and have been doing so for many, many years. We don't always hear about their names. I think there are, of course, the Rom Whitakers and Gauri Shankars and Jerry Martins that everyone would know about. But there are, in Bangalore itself, there would be easily almost 100 such people who are working, many of whom, like me, may just be covering a small area and may not have the reach that some of the larger names do. So this is definitely a field where a lot of people are getting into it, and many people have been established for a long time. And it's also something which I think is quite everyday. It's not a spectacular or grandiose kind of occupation for lots of people.
Thanks for reflecting a little bit on that. And it's so nice to hear your journey and change in mentality towards snakes. And it's also interesting for me to hear that there was a time where Chayant was scared of snakes, because I think ever since I've known
Absolutely,
you,
yeah.
you've been just such a cool cucumber about any snake that we have come across, whether it was in the city or on one of our field trips, whether it was a venomous snake or not, regardless of its size. So clearly, you have come a long way since your childhood years. So what was it like when you first started doing snake rescues? Around when did that start, and what made you decide that this is something I want to do as well?
Well, it wasn't so. I mean, now there's a whole lot of controversy about whether you call them rescues or not in the first place. But when I started out, I wasn't doing that. I was really, really curious. I was a student, and I learned. I kind of taught myself. A few of us taught ourselves how to identify the species around. And then we would target most of the snakes in India are harmless. So they were also the easiest ones to find. And I kind of just started jumping on, the harmless snakes in my area. And I think I cut my teeth on those, which gave a lot of experience. It gave a lot of insight about how they react to people touching them. And you can kind of learn what are the right techniques, when is the snake getting stressed out, when are you likely to okay, when can you anticipate a bite based on what you're doing, based on their body language. And I think after it was years after doing this that I was able to and having been bitten many times by harmless snakes, that I even started to venture towards picking up things which were actually dangerous. And I think that was maybe one right way to do it, because it I wasn't as worried about the unknown. I knew a lot about how things can change really quickly when you're working with an animal, and also some of the telltale signs that an animal is stressed. I think that's something that anyone who's working with animals, doesn't have to be snakes, but can even be your pets at home. Once you're able to read um, displays of stress and aggression, or even self-defense, it makes the whole interaction a lot easier, and it makes you able to control that a lot better.
That's very insightful. And it's nice to know that there are some clear steps that you should be following, and you shouldn't just be jumping into the deep end because you're interested in something like this and you want to, and that there is a right way to approach it. Because, like you were saying, it can be dangerous, it can be problematic, but not necessarily if you know what you're doing. So, um, tell us a little more about what kind of snakes you do find in Bangalore, because now for several years you've been slowly learning and observing and seeing what kind of species are there in the city. And I'm sure you have personally handled and come across so many of them as well. So, what is the biodiversity like right now?
So I think it's really dependent on which part of the city you're in.
Mm-hmm.
I think there are trends for each specific locality, but there are also overarching trends which I believe would be true for many cities in India today. So there are close to, I think, there are over 20 different species that you can find in the greater Bangalore area. And it's much like with birds. If you're in the center of the city, you will see pigeons and parakeets and kites, and there are a few species which are super common. And as you go further and further out to different green pockets, different types of habitats, you'll find different kinds of birds. And it's very much true with snakes as well. So there are 4 or 5 really common species which you will find almost anywhere in the city, and these are the most iconic cobra. The cobra is probably one of the most successful species in the whole country. Then there's also the rat snake, which many people confuse for cobras. They're one of the largest snakes that we have here, and in my opinion, one of the most impressive. They're really fast, they're super active and agile, and they're extremely strong. And then you have one species which I guarantee you will find anywhere from a gutter to a well to a drain to a river, and that's the checkered keelback,
Mm-hmm.
also our water snake. And then there are a handful of other species which are also common, but these three seem to dominate. As you go into different areas, so around my home, we have a lot of wolf snakes which come out after dark, and we also have a lot of cobras, rat snakes, and water snakes. But we have some species which you can't find very easily in the city. So there are lesser known species like shield tails. Um, there's a personal favorite of mine called the black-headed snake. And we also get um, And we also get these beautiful snakes, which are, very aptly called trinkets. They're extremely gentle snakes. They have a terrifying defensive behavior, which will scare, even the most experienced handler. But they're absolutely gorgeous and really lovely snakes. It's sad that because they move so slowly and they have this habit of coming, onto roads when the light is falling. Most of the ones that I have seen around my house have been ones which are dead on the roads. But yeah, it's quite remarkable. The scientific name for it, the species epithet, is Helena, and it's derived from Helen of Troy, who of course was known for her remarkable beauty.
So tell me a little bit more about the black-headed snake. Why is it your personal favorite?
So this is a snake which is really, really inoffensive and unobtrusive, and most people would probably miss it. I have actually seen it only a handful of times. I saw it twice when I was in school, and I think I saw it another 3 or 4 times around my house. And it's extremely hard to find from my experience. People say that they hang out in leaf litter and under stone piles. I have only ever found them. I have never found them myself. I've always come across them when someone else has found them. And so that's kind of a species which is a bit of a challenge for me, I think. And it's a very small snake. It only grows to about a foot and a half long. Um, and when you look at it really closely, it has these gorgeous patterns on the head and throughout the body. And there's a slight color change from the mid body and towards the tail. And I think that it's so easy to miss, because if you see it at a distance, it just looks like a brown snake in the leaves. But when you look close, there are colors which are really hard to describe. But there's yellows, blacks, this amazing purple, and of course brown and gray. So yeah, I think it's quite amazing. You see this with birds, plants, insects. From a distance, they may look drab, but when you look close, they have really, really intricate patterns sometimes. So I think this snake kind of characterizes all of those things at once.
Wow, that's so beautiful. I hope one day I get to see it with you, or it just sounds spectacular.
Yeah, I hope so too.
So let's shift gears a bit into what your experience has been, in the recent past with working with snakes, and like you said, removing them from tricky situations as and when needed. How has that experience been for you, and how does it contrast to when you first started and when you were still figuring out your comfort zone with snakes? And share some stories from your current work with them.
So I'll start actually with when I first started out. And when I first started out, I just wanted to, get up close and personal and learn more. And it wasn't necessarily to be able to handle or to be able to do rescues, or, there wasn't a larger goal in mind. I think it was just curiosity and a bit of adrenaline. And snakes were cool. I fell into that common trap of jumping on them because they were cool. And I remember getting into quite a bit of trouble in school because uh, I had this one experience where there's this gorgeous snake which you have seen as well many times, which is the vine snake.
Mhm.
Um, and it's sometimes hard to find because they camouflage so well on trees. And I think we found one which was close to 6 feet long, and almost an inch in girth, which is enormous for that species. And I remember picking it up and trying to take some photos. And vine snakes have a very clear threat display. When they're scared, they open their mouths, they look straight at you, and they puff up their bodies. And if you get too close, they will do like a mock strike. They'll pretend to strike at you. And all of this was happening at the time. I remember a teacher coming up later and saying, reprimanding me pretty harshly and saying that, at that point in time, it looked like the photos that you were taking precedence over the snake's well-being.
Mm-hmm.
And no one had ever said that to me, as a 15 or 16-year-old kid. I hadn't even thought about what I'd put the animal through to have my bit of fun. Um, and I think that kind of directed me to be a little more purposeful with what I was doing and try to at least have, you know, that thought in the back of my head when you see a snake, you can get very overwhelmed by the moment and things can happen quickly. And I think just being able to stop and take a small step back, that was something which was definitely new to me. I try to do that even today. That person's words have definitely stayed, in my head. Today, I don't find myself doing what I did back then much. I'm much more happy to just find snakes and watch them as they are. There are still times when I'll find something new or something particularly exciting, which I'll try and get closer to. But most of my handling comes from when we need to address an issue, and that's to remove a snake from the place that it is in. And I'll be honest, most of my rescues today could probably be avoided altogether. People still have a habit of calling you, even if they just see a snake while parking their car, or while walking out on the road. And the snake would probably find its own way out of that situation quite well. But we tend to see them as something which doesn't belong, and something which should be out in the wilderness and not close to our homes. So I still get a lot of calls for snakes which are maybe close to people's homes but not inside. They're not causing any issues. By and large, I try and convince people to just wait and observe and let the snake go about its business. But every so often there will be someone who's extremely insistent, and if I'm worried either for their well-being or what they may do to the snake, we will remove it and take it a few tens of feet away. We'll take it a short distance away and release it there. There are a few situations where you definitely do have to remove snakes, and most often those happen when in the rainy season or in the very hot season, when snakes are looking either for a shady or a dry place. And it so happens that our homes are perfect environments for that. um, something that I heard in a talk made a lot of sense, which is that snakes tend to like the same kinds of habitats that we do, which
Yeah.
are kind of stable temperature and not too dry, not too wet. And so they happen to come close to people. But so those are the situations where we will remove them. And especially if it's a venomous snake close to someone's house, then that's a no-brainer.
Mhm.
There are a few which may or may not go away by themselves. So one in particular is the Russell's viper. I have found them coming into the strangest situations, in people's backyards or people's houses, and occasionally even climbing up to first floor balconies, which I had no idea until a couple of weeks ago that they could even do. So in those situations, we will remove them, no questions asked.
Right. You bring up so many important points about the ethics of working with snakes, and it seems like so much of it is lived experience, and I can see how much of an impact that's had on you, just from having seen a couple of videos of you interacting with people while you're doing some of these rescues and while you're removing a snake from these situations. And now when you're doing these things, you come across as somebody who's really level headed, very cool about it. You have a very easygoing body language, and you also seem to take an effort to talk people through what you're doing, explain what you're doing, and you also seem to talk a little bit about the snake that you're handling. So have you seen that make much of a difference in the places where you're staying, where, there are these gradual incremental efforts towards raising awareness and just talking more about snakes? And have you seen any changes or any trends in how people perceive snakes and how they react to these situations because of the steady work that you've been doing here?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's twofold. I think one is the reason that I take time to, talk to people, walk them through what's happening as we're doing a rescue, or after it's done, talk to them about the animal and why it's not the worst thing in the world to have as a neighbor, is because I do think that a lot of the response that people have um, comes from a place of not knowing and being afraid because of the unknown, and because of maybe the sensationalization of wildlife in general and snakes in particular. There's a lot of marketing that relies heavily on making snakes as something that's scary, something to be watchful of. And I think that walking people step by step through what we're doing when we're trying to rescue them, what we're doing when we try to allow people to live with them, it and even sometimes having them touch a snake or look closely at it so that they can learn a little bit about how to identify it. I think it helps I wouldn't say humanize them, but it helps us sympathize in some sense with what it must be like to be an animal that has so few tools at its disposal. They can't hear the same way that we do, they can't move uh, as maybe efficiently as we can, and yet they manage to do so well. And I think as soon as I'm able to if I'm able to make people have even the slightest bit of wonder about them, it changes something inside. And you see this a lot with younger kids, who are maybe not terrified, who are kind of open to touching a snake. The moment that someone puts their hands on a snake's body for the first time, the reaction is very, very much along the lines of, "Oh, I thought it was going to be slimy. Um, oh, it's so strong. Oh, it feels like a fish's body." And there's a lot of like there are these tiny aha moments. And I think the more that people have them, the more curious they are, and the more perhaps tolerant they will be. I've definitely seen it in a few instances here. There is, I've talked to you before about one cobra who kept coming back, and we learned how to recognize him. He kept coming back to the same house. And the first time that that family had called us, they were terrified. They were having a cup of tea, and the snake was behind their chair. And they realized only they sat after they sat down. So they wanted it removed that time. And as time went by and we kept seeing the same cobra at their house, there were a couple of times when it came and it was really dramatically eating a toad. One time it took something like 4 hours to finish its meal. And the family's attitude started to change. And they had I think a 3-year-old son who named the snake. And uh, I think by the second or third visit, they started telling us, you guys can come, but don't remove him. Let's just watch and see what happens. And after a point, I think they stopped calling us altogether. So they would tell us a week or 2 weeks after the fact that they had seen it, entering their car bonnet or something like that. One thing which I think doesn't come across when you talk to me, or when you see me doing a rescue, or when you see any rescuer catching a snake or handling an animal, is not just the amount of experience that has gone into it, but the amount of mistakes that have had happened in order to get to that level of comfort.
Mhm.
There have been so many things which I look back at now, and I know that I was not doing things the right way. There were several issues there were several times with even venomous snakes like cobras and vipers, where if I were to see someone else rescuing them that way, I would immediately register, all the things going wrong. Or even if I were to see myself doing it now. And I think it's the sad truth is that we don't have a systematic way of learning how to be a snake handler in India. And that means that for me, for so many people who do it today, and for many, hundreds of people who are going to start in the future, they will be learning on their own. I think it's in some sense there is the scope for people to get extremely skilled and to learn newer and better ways. But um, the sad truth is that a lot of people are going to make potentially dangerous mistakes, and either the snakes or people are going to pay the cost for that. Most often, unfortunately, it's going to be the snakes. I remember, I think a year or two ago, the Kerala Forest Department started like a certification program where they would be training people how to handle. Um, Gauri Shankar from the Kalinga Center for Rainforest Ecology also runs these storm workshops, which focus on training rescuers. There are small initiatives like this in different pockets. I think the Karnataka Forest Department is also starting something in collaboration with Jerry Martin and a few others. And we're edging towards the right direction, where we can be a supportive group of rescuers and trainers. But we have a long way to go. And hopefully the years of mistakes that I and many others have made can be like a lesson to other people on what not to do.
It's always good to hear somebody coming from a place of self-awareness and reflection, because I think we don't do enough of that, regardless of the fields we are in, and regardless of which niche we find ourselves in within wildlife biology and conservation circles as well. There's always the need to kind of pause and look back and see whether what we're doing is making a difference, whether we're doing it right, whether there's any point, just reassessing sense of purpose as well. I think we need to do so much more of that, and it's always good to hear and see people doing that, because at least it means you're moving forward, and it's that's always something which is optimistic. I also want to go back for a second to what you were talking about in terms of perceptions. And I think that's so interesting, because on this podcast as well, we have spoken about anthropomorphism and how, there's so many different species. If you were talking about a gibbon, for example, like we did in the first episode of this season, it's so easy to humanize them and to empathize with them, because they are so much like us, just morphologically, right, just visually. And so it's not a huge leap in imagination to think about their plight, but it does get so much harder when you think about taxa like reptiles, because visually they are nothing like people. But if you really break it down and you look at what their lives in these human environments are actually like, you can kind of guide somebody's thought process in that direction, I guess. And I think it's very interesting to hear that you have seen this happen, and that it is actually possible, and people are beginning to sympathize with snakes and understand a little bit more about their needs because of the kind of communication work you're doing.
To that end, I often think about the story that the essay that we read together, which during the MSc course, which is that Face of the Spider.
Yeah.
And I think like reptiles, yeah, for sure, they're not easy to relate with, to find some part of yourself in. But it would be, say, far more harder with perhaps a cuttlefish or a plant. There are degrees of removedness that we seem to have.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure where the balance is between anthropomorphizing and dehumanizing.
Mm-hmm.
And with snakes, I think because there are such strong feelings, I often find myself having to, strategically use tools of anthropomorphism to help lend sympathy to something which would otherwise be very othered and easier to justify, say, killing. I don't know what the ethical qualms around that would be. I do the same thing, with maybe with, since we live in India. I mean, and we have such strong religious ties to snakes. So, people do use ways of manipulation with religion and other such things to get the response that maybe we want. And I don't know what the right way is to go with that. This is definitely something which I think we do need to be actively talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it is a very important conversation to have. And I'm also happy you brought up and referenced David Quammen's essay, because it is very relevant here. And I'll find a PDF of it and share it in the show notes maybe, because I think it's just a lovely perception, and I think worldview to kind of have at the back of your mind when you're having these kind of conversations. And definitely there's a lot to think about with respect to dehumanizing, and just which taxa you can go how far with, because it is a fine line often. And there's definitely a lot of merits to helping people empathize with animals, but of course there could be potential negative consequences, and we maybe don't know the whole the entire capacity of the negative consequence and the extent to which it can be problematic until it happens. So I guess a lot of trial and error would be involved when it comes to these things, because I think also, as any form of conservationist, a lot of our job is just marketing, right? The way we market the species we're trying to preserve and protect. And I don't think we realize how much of time we spend advocating for and speaking for a lot of these species. So yeah, have a lot of interesting things to think about there.
Yeah, I mean, I think this goes back to the earlier section where we're talking about where I said, we learn from our mistakes, and where you've also mentioned that this is an iterative process, and what we're doing today, perhaps 10 years down the line, we'll realize was has far-reaching effects. But with a lot of these fields, which, and especially for people who are working on the ground, and less theoretically, you do need to find your way through the darkness, and hopefully you're finding your way, you're muddling through in a way that makes sense, and you're building upon the mistakes which have been learned. So my hope is that collectively, um, you know snake handlers and people who work directly with animals, and have contact with animals directly, um, are making their way towards the most perhaps ethically sound direction, both for animals and the communities who have to live next to them all the time.
I think now, I have, while we're wrapping up our conversation, I have just a couple more questions, which are more about you and your journey in this field and how things have changed for you over time. And like you were saying in the beginning, you've had a lot of wonderful early experiences with viewing a lot of biodiversity right around you. And I also know that that has contributed to you having a really good grasp on natural history, and you're great with just IDing species and knowing about their basic ecology across taxa, not just with snakes. And you're also great with birds, and your frogs, and there are so many other species that you have a good understanding of. And while you ended up, pursuing an education which kind of trained you into how to be a good academic and how to actually pursue research in this field, you now, after having completed your bachelor's and master's, you've gone into a space where you're realizing academics is not really for you. So what led to that shift, and how has that been, and what are the things you're up to now which are kind of allowing you to continue using your knowledge of ecology and natural history and still being able to produce some interesting outputs from it all?
When I was when I was in school, I think I started getting interested in the natural world when I was about 14 or 15 or something around that age. And I thought that the only route to do that was to get a master's degree in some kind of ecology based field. And I pushed myself down that route for many, many years. And I eventually got the master's degree. But there were several things which I was innately drawn to in school, which ended up taking a backseat, either consciously or unconsciously. I remember being very fond of sketching and painting. And I also remember at one point getting quite interested in photography. And these were both things which I stopped immediately out of school, and I didn't touch for years. Today, I'm at a place where I've realized that I was probably forcing myself down a route which was not the right one for me. I I have dabbled in academia, but I realized fairly early on that it wasn't going to be a right fit. And you can't really force something into a mold that doesn't fit it. And I think that's true for many things, but definitely for my career. Um, I've actually found myself going back to more creative pursuits now. And, I still enjoy sketching and painting. It takes me a lot longer to do it now that I've had so many years of not practicing it, but I'm having a lot of fun, and I'm mostly drawing birds. But it gives me a great amount of joy to do it. I also I've tried to fall back in love with photography, and that's through video. So this is something which I'm still learning a lot about, and I'm hoping that at some point in the future I'll be able to turn it towards a ecology wildlife direction. Right now, I'm still learning the ropes and having a blast with that. But whatever the field, whether it's creating something or talking to people about wildlife in some capacity, I feel that the the need to um, the need to move towards how do I put this? I feel that the need to push towards some kind of science communication is really strong. And there are so many cool people, whether it's I've had the great pleasure of over the years having fantastic mentors and having interacted with so many incredibly bright conservationists, and many of them were my classmates like you in my masters, who are doing incredible things today, but who have stories which need to be shared. And it's great that there are podcasts, there are videos, there are so many formats to do that today. So I'd love to be able to make whatever make whatever strides I can, so that I can highlight people's work. I'm not. Um, I think it's only going to be of growing importance as we go forward, and especially with the current state of the environment and in general, public goodwill towards it. We will always need to have all of our stories told, and and the stories of the animals and places that we work with and the people who we work with.
That's that's so well put. In fact, I'm tempted to just take a snippet of what you just said and use it to promote the podcast and why we need it. But you're very right. I think science communication is just going to start being more and more important, and we are going to have to find newer ways to communicate that science. It's going to have to be done in different ways. You know, whether it's medium or whether nature of content for different demographies. I think there's just so much work there, and just the researchers who are working in this field or even on ground conservationists, I mean, they don't often have the skills or bandwidth or time to put that information out there, and you do need external help very often. And I think somebody like you, who also has those skills. I mean, have you haven't emphasized enough how good you are at a lot of the things you're pursuing right now. And as an external person, I can definitely say that the kind of stuff you're creating now is just fabulous, and it's so great to have that kind of content available now for people to use through different science com mediums. So that's so great, and I'm very excited to see the kind of content that you keep creating in the years to come, because it's already exciting to see what you've put out so far. Yeah.
This is definitely a situation where the pot and the kettle are talking about how black each other are. So I think one of the cool things about what you just said is that the medium almost doesn't matter. I mean, maybe today, social media prioritizes video, but the cool thing is that you and Akshay have this incredible podcast, and podcasting is one of the oldest forms of mass communication that we've had. We've had radio since my grandparents' generation, and it's so much more relevant, or it's equally relevant today, where I think the people who are listening to this, your wonderful following is just a testament to that. And there's no way that there's no one good way, I think, to tell a story, whether it's in an audio format or whether it's through artwork. So the coolest thing that I'm seeing now is that so many people working in ecology have these hidden talents, which perhaps at some point they thought that they weren't going to, fuse with their study. But it's one of the most heartwarming things for me to see that many people working in ecology and conservation are also extremely talented communicators. Um, and I'm hoping that they'll only continue to push that as much as they can, and wherever they can't, that's, I think, where channels like your podcast and people who do what I do come in and take it to the next level, hopefully.
Yeah, no, that's super, and I hope that is true and that continues happening. um, I'm actually going to close now with one last question. We of course spent most of this recording talking about your love for snakes and the amount of time you've dedicated to snakes, but I also know that you are quite the birder and you have a deep love for birds. So I guess my last question to you is, reptiles or birds?
you know that's a really hard one. Reptiles would definitely, it's not even all reptiles. I'm quite terrible with lizards, crocodiles, turtles. um I know really, I really only know snakes.
Mhm.
But reptiles and birds, snakes would definitely be on top, just because I fell in love with them first.
Yeah.
And with birds, maybe the timing was wrong. I still love them, but they don't hold a candle to snakes for me. Um, and also, I think there's one very the clincher of it is that if you want to be a bird watcher, you have to get up early, and that's just not me. I love that I can go around looking for snakes at 2 in the morning, but if I'm not up by dawn, I'm going to miss the birds.
Yeah, I think that's a very practical way of looking at things.
It is a really practical way, but the actual, I mean, in all seriousness, I would still find it very difficult to give you a solid either or.
Mhm.
And I think in many ways, birds and snakes are very similar. They're evolutionarily, behaviorally, there isn't a whole lot that's different between the two once you go beyond, the wings and the feathers and scales.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think it's no surprise that I'm interested in both.
Well, thanks so much, Chayant. This has just been so wonderful to have this conversation with you. And I'm really glad that we could do this. Thanks for sharing your stories.
Me too. Thank you for having me on the podcast. And yeah, I'm I'm looking forward to all the exciting tales you're going to tell.
Thanks for listening.